Harold Mitchell adjusted his worn postal uniform for what felt like the 100th time that morning. At 72 years old, his shoulders had developed a permanent hunch from decades of carrying mail bags, and his weathered hands showed the telltale signs of countless paper cuts and harsh winter deliveries. The young soldiers at Fort Bradley barely acknowledged him as he shuffled through the base entrance, their crisp uniforms and polished boots a stark contrast to his faded blue shirt and scuffed shoes. The morning sun cast long shadows across the military installation as Harold began his familiar route. He had been delivering mail to this base for over 15 years, ever since he retired from his first career, and needed something to keep himself busy. The work wasn't glamorous, but it gave him purpose and a small income to supplement his meager pension. As he wheeled his cart through the administrative buildings, Harold couldn't help but overhear the whispered comments and barely concealed snickers from the younger personnel. "Look at the old guy," one private muttered to his buddy. "Bet he never saw a day of real action in his life." Another soldier rolled his eyes as Harold fumbled with his keys at the mailroom door. "They'll hire anyone these days," the soldier said loud enough for Harold to hear. The comments stung more than Harold let on. These young men and women had no idea what he had been through, what he had seen, or what he had sacrificed for his country. But he kept his head down and continued his work, sorting letters and packages with the same methodical precision he had maintained for years. Lieutenant Sarah Chun was one of the few people on base who treated Harold with genuine respect. She always greeted him with a warm smile and asked about his health and his grandchildren. On this particular Tuesday morning, she noticed Harold seemed more subdued than usual as he delivered her mail. "Everything all right, Mr. Mitchell?" she asked, looking up from her desk as he placed a stack of envelopes in her inbox. Harold paused for a moment, considering whether to share his frustration. "Just the usual, Lieutenant. Some of the younger folks think I'm just an old man taking up space." Sarah frowned. She had witnessed some of the disrespectful behavior toward Harold and had always found it disappointing. "I'm sorry about that. Some people don't understand that respect should be earned through character, not just age or position." "It's all right," Harold replied, though his voice carried a hint of weariness. "I've dealt with worse things in my time." As Harold continued his rounds, the situation escalated near the enlisted barracks. A group of soldiers was gathered around the entrance, apparently having some kind of heated discussion about weekend leave policies. When Harold approached with their mail, one of them, Sergeant Jake Morrison, turned his frustration toward the elderly postman. "Great. Here comes Grandpa with our rejection letters," Morrison said loudly, causing his friends to chuckle. "Bet you never had to worry about getting leave denied when you were sitting behind some desk during whatever war you pretend you fought in." Harold's jaw tightened, but he remained silent, continuing to sort through the mail with steady hands. His movements were deliberate and calm, a composure that came from years of training and experience that these young soldiers couldn't begin to imagine. "What's wrong, old man? Cat got your tongue?" Another soldier joined in, emboldened by Morrison's lead. "Or are you just trying to remember which desk job you had during Vietnam?" The group's laughter grew louder, attracting attention from other personnel in the area. Harold could feel dozens of eyes on him, waiting to see how the old postman would respond to the increasingly aggressive taunts. His hands never stopped moving, efficiently organizing the mail by room number and rank, but something subtle changed in his demeanor. Maybe he was one of those guys who spent the whole war filing papers in some air-conditioned office in Saigon. Morrison continued, clearly enjoying the attention he was getting from his audience. Probably never even heard a shot fired in anger. Harold finally looked up, meeting Morrison's eyes directly. For just a moment, something flickered in the old man's gaze, something that made Morrison take an involuntary step back. It was the look of a man who had seen things that would haunt most people for the rest of their lives. The steady stare of someone who had faced death and made impossible decisions under unimaginable pressure. But the moment passed quickly, and Harold simply nodded politely. "Your mail, Sergeant," he said quietly, holding out Morrison's letters. Morrison snatched the mail roughly, accidentally causing Harold to stumble slightly. "Watch where you're going, Grandpa," he sneered, though there was less confidence in his voice now. As Harold steadied himself, he rolled up his sleeves slightly to adjust his grip on the mail cart. The movement was small and seemingly insignificant, but Lieutenant Chun, who had been walking by and witnessed the entire exchange, caught sight of something that made her stop in her tracks. There, partially visible on Harold's weathered forearm, was the edge of what appeared to be a faded military tattoo. She couldn't make out the details from her distance, but she could see enough to know it was something significant. The design looked old, the kind of tattoo that soldiers got during wartime, not the decorative artwork that was popular today. Sarah's mind began racing. She had always suspected there was more to Harold's story than he let on. The way he carried himself, despite his age and the physical demands of his job, had a military precision that she recognized. His punctuality was legendary. He arrived at exactly the same time every day and completed his routes with clockwork efficiency. Even the way he organized his mail cart showed a systematic approach that spoke of military training. The harassment continued as Harold finished distributing the mail to that section of the barracks. Morrison and his friends kept making comments about old-timers and wannabe veterans, but Harold maintained his professional composure throughout. When he was done, he simply nodded to the group and moved on to the next building. However, Sarah noticed that Harold's movements had become even more precise and controlled than usual. It was as if the confrontation had triggered some kind of automatic response, a return to a more disciplined and alert state of mind. She had seen the same thing happen with combat veterans when they felt threatened or disrespected. As Harold disappeared around the corner of the next building, Sarah made a mental note to keep an eye on the situation. She had a feeling that there was much more to their elderly postman than anyone on the base realized, and the partial glimpse of that tattoo had only confirmed her suspicions. The morning continued with its usual routine, but something had shifted. Word of Morrison's confrontation with Harold began to spread through the barracks, with some soldiers finding it amusing while others felt uncomfortable with the level of disrespect shown to an elderly man just trying to do his job. Harold completed his rounds methodically, but those who bothered to look closely might have noticed that he carried himself differently now. The slouch in his shoulders seemed less pronounced, and his movements had taken on a more purposeful quality. It was as if the morning's events had awakened something that had been dormant for many years. As he returned his cart to the mail room and prepared to head home for the day, Harold caught sight of his reflection in the window. The face looking back at him was lined with age and marked by years of hard work, but the eyes still held the same intensity that had once been focused on very different kinds of missions in very different circumstances. He rolled down his sleeves carefully, making sure the tattoo was completely covered, and headed for the exit. Tomorrow would bring another day of deliveries, another day of subtle disrespect from people who had no idea what he had been through. But Harold had endured far worse things than the thoughtless comments of young soldiers, and he would continue to do his job with the same quiet dignity he had maintained for over 15 years. The next few days at Fort Bradley passed much like any other, except that Sergeant Morrison's treatment of Harold had emboldened others to join in the mockery. What had started as occasional snide comments had evolved into a daily ritual of humiliation that followed Harold throughout his mail route. On Wednesday morning, Private First Class Danny Rodriguez was waiting by the communications building when Harold arrived with the morning mail. "Hey, mailman," Rodriguez called out with a smirk. "My grandmother wants to know if you two went to school together back in the Stone Age." A small crowd of soldiers had gathered, anticipating another round of entertainment at Harold's expense. They watched as the old man carefully sorted through the mail, his weathered fingers moving with practiced efficiency despite the verbal assault. Seriously, though, Morrison had joined the group, apparently making this harassment a regular part of his morning routine. "What did you actually do during the war, old man? I'm genuinely curious how someone your age avoided real military service." Harold continued his work silently, but Lieutenant Sarah Chun, who happened to be passing by, noticed something that others missed. When Morrison mentioned military service, Harold's hands had paused for just a fraction of a second. It was subtle, but it was there, the kind of involuntary response that suggested the topic hit closer to home than Harold wanted to admit. "Maybe he was a cook," suggested another soldier. "Or one of those guys who cleaned latrines while the real soldiers did the fighting. That would explain why he's so good at handling other people's crap," Morrison added, causing the group to erupt in laughter. Sarah had had enough. She stepped forward, her voice cutting through the laughter with military authority. "That's enough. Don't you all have actual duties to attend to?" The soldiers scattered quickly, not wanting to face any disciplinary action, but Morrison lingered just long enough to mutter, "Just having some fun, Lieutenant. No harm meant." After the group dispersed, Sarah approached Harold, who was finishing up with the mail distribution for that building. "I'm sorry about that, Mr. Mitchell. That behavior is completely unacceptable." Harold looked up at her with tired but grateful eyes. "Thank you, Lieutenant, but you don't need to fight my battles for me. I've been dealing with difficult people a lot longer than those boys have been alive." There was something in the way he said it that made Sarah pause. The phrase "fighting battles" had come naturally to him, and there was a weight behind his words that suggested experience with actual conflict, not just workplace disagreements. "Mr. Mitchell," she said carefully, "I hope you don't mind me asking, but did you serve in the military yourself?" Harold was quiet for a long moment, considering his response. Finally, he said, "A long time ago, in a very different world." Before Sarah could ask any follow-up questions, Harold had gathered his cart and moved on to the next building. But his brief answer had confirmed her suspicions. There was definitely more to Harold Mitchell than met the eye. The harassment campaign reached its peak on Friday afternoon when Morrison and several of his friends decided to stage what they called Operation Mockingbird. They had timed their break to coincide with Harold's delivery to the motor pool, where they knew they would have a larger audience. As Harold approached with the afternoon mail, Morrison stood up and began a theatrical salute. "Attention everyone. The decorated war hero has arrived." The soldiers in the motor pool looked up from their vehicle maintenance, some confused by Morrison's performance, others beginning to smile as they realized what was happening. "I hear our mailman here is a real tough guy," Morrison continued, his voice dripping with sarcasm. "Probably single-handedly won whatever war he claims to have fought in." Harold continued his approach, his expression neutral, but Sarah, who had been following at a distance after hearing about Morrison's planned entertainment, noticed that Harold's posture had changed again. He was walking with a more measured stride, his shoulders square, his head up. It was a transformation that spoke of military bearing returning after years of civilian life. "Come on, Gramps," Morrison pressed, emboldened by the attention he was receiving. "Tell us about your war stories. Did you take any hills? Capture any enemy positions? Or did you spend the whole time hiding behind bigger men?" The motor pool had grown quiet now, with even the soldiers who had initially found Morrison's act amusing beginning to feel uncomfortable with the level of cruelty being displayed. Harold stopped his cart and looked directly at Morrison. For the second time that week, something flickered in his eyes, something that made several of the watching soldiers unconsciously straighten up. "Sergeant Morrison," Harold said quietly, his voice carrying a tone of authority that seemed to come from somewhere deep inside. "I think you might want to reconsider your approach." Morrison, surprised by Harold's directness, doubled down on his aggression. "Oh, now you're giving me orders? What are you going to do about it, old man?" Harold didn't respond immediately. Instead, he began rolling up his sleeves methodically, as if preparing for physical work. The movement was deliberate and controlled, and several of the watching soldiers found themselves paying closer attention. As Harold adjusted his grip on the mail cart, the sleeve of his left arm rode up higher than usual, revealing more of the tattoo that Lieutenant Chun had glimpsed earlier in the week. From her position, she still couldn't make out all the details, but she could see that it was more extensive than she had initially thought. What she could see appeared to be part of a military unit insignia, but it was unlike anything she recognized from her knowledge of modern military units. The artwork looked old and weathered, suggesting it had been done many years ago, possibly decades. Morrison, oblivious to what Sarah was seeing, continued his taunting. "What's that supposed to be? Some kind of fake military tattoo? Did you get that at a county fair to impress the ladies?" Harold finished adjusting his sleeves and looked up at Morrison with an expression that had grown noticeably colder. "Sergeant, I'm going to give you some free advice. Sometimes it's better to show respect for things you don't understand." "Are you threatening me?" Morrison asked, his voice rising as he sensed he might be losing control of the situation. "I'm educating you," Harold replied calmly. "There's a difference, though I suspect you might have trouble recognizing it." The exchange had attracted the attention of Master Sergeant Williams, a career military man who was respected throughout the base for his fairness and no-nonsense approach to discipline. He had been observing the situation from across the motor pool and decided it was time to intervene. What's going on here? Williams asked as he approached the group. Morrison straightened up, suddenly, aware that his behavior was being observed by a senior non-commissioned officer. Just having a conversation with the mailman, Master Sergeant. Williams looked around at the assembled soldiers, most of whom were now trying to look busy with their maintenance tasks. Conversation, huh? Looked more like harassment from where I was standing. No harm intended, Master Sergeant, Morrison said quickly. Just curious about the old guy's background. Williams turned to Harold, who had resumed his mail delivery duties as if nothing had happened. Mr. Mitchell, is there a problem here? Harold looked up from his work, his expression neutral once again. No problem, Master Sergeant. Just doing my job. Williams nodded, but Sarah could see that he was studying Harold more carefully now. Like her, he seemed to sense that there was more to their elderly postman than was immediately apparent. Morrison, Williams said, turning back to the sergeant. I think you and your friends have enough actual work to keep you busy without bothering the mail carrier. Yes, Master Sergeant, Morrison replied, clearly disappointed that his entertainment had been cut short. As the group dispersed and Harold finished his deliveries, Williams lingered in the motor pool, thinking about what he had witnessed. The way Harold had handled himself during the confrontation had caught his attention. There was something about the old man's composure and the way he had spoken to Morrison that suggested military experience. Sarah approached Williams as Harold left the area with his cart. Master Sergeant, did you notice anything unusual about Mr. Mitchell? Williams nodded slowly. Actually, I did. The way he carried himself when things got heated, that's not something you learn in civilian life. And did you catch how he addressed Morrison as Sergeant without being prompted? Most civilians would have said son or just used his name. I noticed that too, Sarah said. And I think he has some kind of military tattoo on his left arm. I've only caught glimpses of it, but it looks old and official. Williams was quiet for a moment, processing this information. You know what? I think it might be time to have a proper conversation with Mr. Mitchell. If he is a veteran, he deserves a lot better treatment than he's been getting around here. As they spoke, Harold was making his way to the final stop on his daily route, the base commander's office in the administrative complex. Colonel Robert Hayes had always been cordial to Harold, treating him with the same professional courtesy he showed to all the civilian contractors who worked on the base. Harold knocked on the open door frame and entered when Colonel Hayes looked up from his paperwork. Afternoon mail, Colonel. Thank you, Harold, Hayes said, accepting the small stack of letters. How are things going today? Harold hesitated for just a moment before responding. Fine, sir. Just fine. But Colonel Hayes, who had been commanding troops for over 20 years, could read people well enough to know when someone was not being entirely truthful. Everything all right? You seem a bit more subdued than usual. Harold considered his response carefully. He had always maintained a professional relationship with the base commander, but he had never shared any personal information about his past. Just some minor friction with a few of the younger soldiers, Colonel. Nothing I can't handle. Hayes frowned. What kind of friction? Nothing serious, sir. Just some comments about my age and assumptions about my background. It's not uncommon for young people to make judgments about older folks. Colonel Hayes leaned back in his chair, studying Harold more closely. There was something about the way the old postman carried himself that had always impressed Hayes, but he had never really considered why. Now, with Harold's mention of comments about his background, Hayes found himself wondering if there was more to the story. Harold, if you don't mind me asking, what did you do before you started working for the Postal Service? Harold was quiet for a moment, as if weighing how much to reveal. I had various jobs over the years, Colonel. Did what needed to be done to support my family. It was a careful non-answer, and Hayes recognized it as such. In his experience, when people were evasive about their past, it was often because they had something significant to hide, either something they were ashamed of or something they were proud of but preferred to keep private. As Harold prepared to leave, Hayes made a decision. Harold, would you mind staying after you finish your route today? I'd like to have a proper conversation with you about your time here on base. Harold nodded respectfully. Of course, Colonel. As Harold left the office, Colonel Hayes found himself thinking about their brief conversation. There had been something in Harold's demeanor, something in the way he had said sir and Colonel, that suggested familiarity with military protocol. It was subtle, but it was there. Colonel Hayes spent the remainder of the afternoon thinking about his conversation with Harold. Something about the elderly postman's demeanor had struck him as familiar, but he couldn't quite place what it was. As a career military officer, Hayes had developed an instinct for recognizing fellow servicemen, even years after they had left the military. There was something in the way they carried themselves, the way they responded to authority, and the way they structured their daily routines that never quite disappeared. When Harold returned to the colonel's office at the end of his shift, Hayes had made some tea and arranged 2 chairs facing each other in a more informal setting than his usual position behind the desk. "Please, have a seat," Hayes said, gesturing to one of the chairs. "I wanted to talk to you about the situation with some of our younger soldiers." Harold sat down carefully, maintaining his respectful posture. "Colonel, I don't want to cause any trouble. These things have a way of working themselves out." Hayes leaned forward slightly. "Harold, in my experience, harassment doesn't just work itself out. It usually gets worse unless someone intervenes." He paused, studying Harold's face. "Lieutenant Chun and Master Sergeant Williams both mentioned that you handled yourself remarkably well under pressure today." "I've dealt with difficult people before, sir." "I'm sure you have," Hayes said. "Harold, I'm going to ask you a direct question, and I hope you'll give me a direct answer. Did you serve in the military?" Harold was quiet for a long moment, his weathered hands folded in his lap. When he finally spoke, his voice was soft but clear. "Yes, sir. A long time ago." Hayes felt a surge of both validation and anger. Validation because his instincts had been correct, and anger because a veteran had been subjected to harassment on his base. "What branch?" "Army, sir. I served in Vietnam from 1968 to 1971. The dates hit Hayes like a physical blow. 1968 to 1971 were some of the bloodiest years of the Vietnam War. Anyone who had served during that period had almost certainly seen intensive combat. "What unit?" Hayes asked, his tone becoming more serious. Harold hesitated again, and Hayes could see an internal struggle playing out on the old man's face. Finally, Harold made a decision and slowly rolled up his left sleeve. The tattoo that was revealed made Colonel Hayes draw in a sharp breath. There, on Harold's weathered forearm, was a faded but unmistakable insignia, a skull wearing a helmet with the number 13 prominently displayed, surrounded by what appeared to be a parachute and wings. Below the main design were the words "Filthy 13" in bold letters. Hayes stared at the tattoo for several seconds, his mind racing. The Filthy 13 was a legendary unit, one of the most famous and feared paratrooper demolition squads of World War II. But the version on Harold's arm was different. It had been modified with Vietnam-era elements. "My God," Hayes said quietly. "Harold, the Filthy 13 was a World War II unit." "How?" Harold looked down at his tattoo, a mixture of pride and sadness crossing his features. "The original Filthy 13 was my father's unit, Colonel. Jake McNeese was his sergeant. After my father was killed at Normandy, I swore I'd carry on the tradition when my time came." Hayes was struggling to process what he was hearing. The original Filthy 13 had been one of the most elite and dangerous units in the European theater, known for their extraordinary courage and their willingness to take on the most dangerous missions behind enemy lines. "When I got to Vietnam," Harold continued, "I ended up in a special operations unit that did similar work. Reconnaissance, sabotage, prisoner snatching, the kind of missions that regular infantry couldn't handle. We started calling ourselves the new Filthy 13. There were never more than 12 or 13 of us at any given time." "Special operations," Hayes repeated. "What kind of special operations?" Harold was quiet for a moment, and Hayes could see that they were approaching territory that was still painful, even after all these years. "We went places where regular troops couldn't go, Colonel. Deep jungle insertions, usually behind enemy lines. Our job was to gather intelligence, disrupt enemy operations, and sometimes eliminate high-value targets." The pieces were falling into place for Hayes. He was looking at a man who had been part of one of the most elite and dangerous units of the Vietnam War, a veteran of missions that most soldiers couldn't even imagine. And this man had been delivering mail to his base for 15 years while being subjected to mockery and disrespect from soldiers who had no idea what real combat looked like. "How many missions?" Hayes asked. 47 confirmed insertions," Harold replied without hesitation. "Some lasted a few days, some lasted weeks. We operated primarily in Cambodia and Laos, though officially we were never there. Hayes sat back in his chair, overwhelmed by what he was learning. 47 missions behind enemy lines was an almost unbelievable number. Most special operations soldiers were lucky to survive a handful of such missions. Harold, why didn't you ever mention this? You've been working here for 15 years, and no one knew you were a decorated veteran. Harold shrugged slightly. What was the point, Colonel? The war ended badly. A lot of people didn't want to hear about what we did over there. It was easier to just move on, find regular work, and try to live a normal life. But you must have received commendations, decorations. 2 silver stars, 3 bronze stars with V device, Purple Heart with oak leaf cluster, and a few others, Harold said matter-of-factly. They're in a box somewhere in my attic. My wife used to say they just reminded her of how close she came to losing me. Hayes was stunned into silence. Harold Mitchell, the elderly postman who had been mocked as a coward and a fake, was one of the most decorated veterans he had ever met. The Silver Star was awarded for exceptional gallantry in combat, and Harold had earned 2 of them. Harold, Hayes said finally, you need to understand something. What you did, the service you provided to your country, it was extraordinary. These young soldiers who have been giving you grief, they have no idea what real courage looks like. Harold looked uncomfortable with the praise. I just did my job, Colonel. Same as everyone else. No, Hayes said firmly. What you did was far beyond just doing your job. 47 missions behind enemy lines. Harold, most soldiers never face that level of danger even once in their entire careers. As they continued talking, Harold began to share more details about his service. He told Hayes about missions where his unit had spent weeks in enemy territory, living off the land and avoiding detection while gathering crucial intelligence. He described firefights in the dense jungle where they had been outnumbered 10-1 but had fought their way out through superior training and sheer determination. One story in particular struck Hayes deeply. Harold described a mission where his unit had been tasked with rescuing a downed pilot who had been captured by North Vietnamese forces. The pilot was being held in a heavily fortified compound deep in enemy territory, and regular forces couldn't reach him without triggering a massive battle that would likely result in the pilot's execution. Harold's team had infiltrated the compound at night, neutralized the guards silently, and extracted the pilot without firing a single shot. The entire operation had taken less than 20 minutes, but it had required weeks of planning and reconnaissance. The pilot was just a kid, Harold said, his voice distant with memory. Couldn't have been more than 22 years old. He was so scared when we found him that he could barely walk. We had to carry him most of the way to the extraction point. What happened to him? Hayes asked. He made it home, Harold said simply. Got married, became a commercial pilot, had kids. He sends me a Christmas card every year. Hayes realized he was listening to stories that belonged in military history books, tales of heroism and sacrifice that most people would never believe if they hadn't come from such a credible source. Harold, why are you telling me this now? Harold was quiet for a moment, rolling down his sleeve to cover the tattoo. Because those boys need to understand something, Colonel. They think they're tough because they've been through basic training and maybe deployed to relatively safe areas. But they have no idea what real war looks like, and they shouldn't be so quick to judge people they don't understand. You're absolutely right, Hayes said. And I'm going to make sure they learn that lesson. Colonel, I don't want to cause trouble for those kids. They're young, they're full of themselves, and they think they know everything. I was the same way when I was their age. Hayes shook his head. Harold, what they've been doing isn't just disrespectful to you personally. It's disrespectful to every veteran who has ever served. They need to learn that respect isn't just about rank and position. It's about recognizing sacrifice and service wherever you find it. As their conversation continued, Hayes learned more about Harold's post-war life. He had returned from Vietnam in 1971 to a country that was deeply divided about the war. Unlike World War II veterans who had been welcomed home as heroes, Vietnam veterans often faced hostility and suspicion from the very people they had served to protect. Harold had struggled with what would later be recognized as PTSD, though at the time there was little understanding or treatment for the condition. He had worked various jobs over the years: construction, factory work, security, always finding it difficult to explain gaps in his employment when his symptoms became too severe to manage. The nightmares were the worst part, Harold admitted. For years, I couldn't sleep for more than a few hours at a time. Every sound, every shadow, could trigger a flashback. My wife was incredibly patient, but it was hard on her and the kids. Did you ever get help? Eventually, yes. But it took decades before I was willing to admit I needed it. Veterans of my generation were taught to tough it out, to not show weakness. It wasn't until the 1990s that I finally started seeing a counselor at the VA. Hayes was struck by the quiet dignity with which Harold spoke about his struggles. There was no self-pity, no anger about the lack of support he had received. He simply accepted what had happened and focused on moving forward. The postal job was perfect for me, Harold continued. Regular hours, clear tasks, minimal interaction with people. It allowed me to feel useful without being overwhelmed. And working on a military base, it felt like home in a way that civilian workplaces never did. As the afternoon wore on, Hayes found himself developing a deep respect for Harold that went far beyond what he had felt for the efficient, polite postman he had known for 15 years. He was looking at a man who had sacrificed his youth, his peace of mind, and arguably his future for his country, and who had spent the subsequent decades quietly rebuilding his life without seeking recognition or compensation for what he had endured. When their conversation finally came to an end, Hayes stood and offered Harold his hand. Harold, it has been an honor to learn about your service. I want you to know that you will never face harassment on this base again. Harold shook his hand firmly. Thank you, Colonel. But I hope you won't be too hard on those boys. They're good soldiers, they just need to learn some perspective. Oh, they're going to learn perspective, Hayes said with a slight smile. I can guarantee you that. The following Monday morning brought an unusual atmosphere to Fort Bradley. Colonel Hayes had spent the weekend researching Harold's military record through official channels, and what he discovered had only reinforced his determination to address the situation decisively. Harold's service record was heavily classified, with many details redacted even decades later, but what Hayes could access painted a picture of a soldier who had consistently volunteered for the most dangerous assignments available. His commendations told the story of a man who had repeatedly risked his life to save others and had demonstrated extraordinary courage under the most extreme circumstances. As Harold began his usual mail route that Monday morning, he was unaware of the changes that Colonel Hayes had set in motion. The first sign that something was different came when he approached the enlisted barracks where Sergeant Morrison and his friends typically gathered for their morning harassment ritual. This time, however, Master Sergeant Williams was waiting for them. Morrison, Rodriguez, Thompson, Jacobs, Williams called out as the soldiers emerged from the barracks. Formation. Now, the soldiers quickly fell into line, surprised by the unexpected formation call. They exchanged confused glances, wondering what they had done to warrant Williams' attention so early in the morning. Gentlemen, Williams began, his voice carrying the authority of 20 years of military service. It has come to my attention that some of you have been engaging in disrespectful behavior toward our mail carrier, Mr. Mitchell. Morrison shifted uncomfortably, but remained silent. Now, I want you to understand something, Williams continued. Respect is not optional in the United States Army. It is a core value that we expect every soldier to demonstrate, regardless of rank or position. When you disrespect a civilian contractor, you disrespect this uniform and everything it represents. The soldiers were beginning to realize that their behavior toward Harold had attracted serious attention from the command structure. However, Williams said, his tone becoming more serious, your behavior becomes exponentially more unacceptable when you consider who you've been targeting. At that moment, Colonel Hayes approached the formation, accompanied by Lieutenant Chun. The soldiers immediately snapped to attention, recognizing that whatever was happening was far more serious than they had initially understood. Gentlemen, Colonel Hayes began, his voice calm but carrying unmistakable authority. I understand you've been having some fun at the expense of our mail carrier. Making jokes about his age, questioning his military service, suggesting he's never seen real combat. Morrison's face had gone pale as he realized that his harassment of Harold had reached the attention of the base commander himself. What you don't know, Hayes continued, is that the man you've been mocking is one of the most decorated combat veterans I've ever had the privilege of meeting. The soldiers exchanged glances, confusion evident on their faces. Harold Mitchell served 3 tours in Vietnam as part of a special operations unit. He completed 47 missions behind enemy lines, missions that most of you couldn't even imagine surviving. He earned 2 silver stars for gallantry in combat, 3 bronze stars with Valor Device, and a Purple Heart with Oak Leaf Cluster. The silence in the formation was complete. Morrison felt as if the ground beneath his feet had suddenly become unstable. For those of you who might not understand what that means, Hayes continued, the Silver Star is the 3rd highest military decoration for valor. It's awarded for exceptional gallantry while engaged in action against an enemy of the United States. Mr. Mitchell has 2 of them. Rodriguez swallowed hard, remembering his joke about Harold's grandmother and feeling sick to his stomach. The Bronze Star with V device is awarded for heroic achievement in combat. Mr. Mitchell has 3 of them. The Purple Heart is awarded to those wounded in action against an enemy. The Oak Leaf Cluster indicates he was wounded multiple times. Colonel Hayes paused, letting the weight of his words sink in. So when you suggested that Mr. Mitchell had never seen real combat, when you implied that he was a coward who had hidden behind others during wartime, you were insulting a man who has demonstrated more courage in a single mission than most people show in their entire lives. The soldiers stood frozen, processing the magnitude of their error. But here's what makes this even worse, Hayes continued. Mr. Mitchell never defended himself against your attacks. He never mentioned his service record, never tried to put you in your place, never used his considerable military experience to humiliate you the way you tried to humiliate him. Do you know why? No one answered. Because real courage doesn't need to prove itself to children. Because a man who has faced actual life and death situations doesn't need to justify himself to soldiers who have never been tested under real fire. Because true warriors don't waste time arguing with people who wouldn't understand what they've been through. Morrison felt as if he might be sick. The memory of his taunts, his suggestions that Harold was a fake and a coward, now seemed like the worst kind of nightmare. Sergeant Morrison, Hayes said, focusing his attention on the soldier who had led the harassment campaign. Yes, sir, Morrison replied, his voice barely above a whisper. You asked Mr. Mitchell what he had done during the war. Since he's too modest to tell you himself, let me share one example. Hayes pulled out a folder he had been carrying. On March 15, 1970, Mr. Mitchell's unit was tasked with extracting a captured pilot from a heavily fortified enemy compound. The pilot had been shot down 3 days earlier and was being held for interrogation. Hayes opened the folder and began reading from Harold's mission report. The compound was guarded by an estimated 30 enemy soldiers and was located 15 kilometers behind enemy lines. A conventional rescue operation would have required a full battalion and would likely have resulted in the pilot's execution before our forces could reach him. The soldiers listened in stunned silence as Hayes described Harold's mission in clinical, military terms. Mr. Mitchell's team infiltrated the compound at 0200 hours. Using silent elimination techniques, they neutralized 6 guards without raising an alarm. They located the pilot, who was injured and barely conscious, and extracted him from the compound. During the extraction, they encountered an enemy patrol and engaged in a running firefight for over 3 kilometers before reaching the extraction point. Hayes closed the folder and looked at Morrison directly. The pilot they rescued was 22 years old, probably about your age, Sergeant. He had been tortured for 3 days and would almost certainly have been executed if Mr. Mitchell's team hadn't reached him. That pilot went home to his family because Mr. Mitchell was willing to risk his life for a stranger. Morrison's knees felt weak. The enormity of what Harold had done, combined with the cruelty of his own behavior, was overwhelming. This is just one mission, Hayes continued. Mr. Mitchell completed 46 others just like it. 47 times, he voluntarily entered enemy territory knowing that he might not come back. 47 times, he chose duty and courage over safety and comfort. Lieutenant Chin stepped forward. Gentlemen, I want you to understand something. When you mock a veteran, you're not just insulting that individual. You're insulting every person who has ever worn this uniform, everyone who has ever sacrificed for their country, and everyone who has ever lost their life in service to America. But, in this case, she continued, you've been mocking a man who represents the very best of what American soldiers can be. A man who exemplifies the values we claim to uphold: courage, honor, duty, and sacrifice. Master Sergeant Williams stepped forward again. Here's what's going to happen. Each of you is going to write a formal letter of apology to Mr. Mitchell. These letters will be reviewed by me personally, and if they don't demonstrate genuine remorse and understanding of what you've done, you'll rewrite them until they do. Additionally, Colonel Hayes added, you will each spend 20 hours of your personal time volunteering at the local VA hospital. I want you to see what real veterans look like, to understand the sacrifices that have been made for your freedom. Furthermore, Williams continued, you will attend a mandatory seminar on military history and veteran affairs. You will learn about the service and sacrifice of veterans from all conflicts, so that you never again make the mistake of disrespecting someone whose service you don't understand. Morrison raised his hand tentatively. Sir, permission to speak? Hayes nodded. Sir, is there any way we can apologize to Mr. Mitchell personally? I mean, beyond the written letters? Hayes studied Morrison's face, seeing what appeared to be genuine remorse and shame. Sergeant, that would depend on Mr. Mitchell. He would have every right to refuse to see any of you. Your behavior toward him has been inexcusable. I understand that, sir. But if he would be willing, I need him to know how sorry I am. We all do. Hayes considered this request. I'll ask him. But understand that if he agrees to meet with you, it will be an act of extraordinary grace on his part. You will show him the respect he has always deserved, and you will listen to whatever he chooses to tell you without interruption or justification. As the formation was dismissed, and the soldiers returned to their duties, word of Harold's true identity began to spread throughout the base. By midday, everyone at Fort Bradley knew that their humble mail carrier was a decorated war hero who had served his country with extraordinary distinction. When Harold arrived for his afternoon route, he noticed that something had changed dramatically. Soldiers who had previously ignored him now stood at attention when he passed. Officers who had barely acknowledged his existence now greeted him with respectful nods and words of thanks for his service. The transformation was so complete and so sudden that Harold felt uncomfortable with the attention. He had spent 15 years blending into the background, doing his job quietly and without fanfare. The sudden recognition of his military service felt overwhelming after decades of anonymity. Lieutenant Chin found him during his rounds and gently explained what had happened. Colonel Hayes felt it was important that everyone on base understand who you really are, she said. He wanted to make sure that you receive the respect you've always deserved. Harold was quiet for a moment, processing this information. Lieutenant, I never asked for special treatment. I just wanted to do my job. I know, she replied. But, Mr. Mitchell, your service deserves recognition. What you did for your country, the sacrifices you made, people should know about that. Later that afternoon, Harold was approached by Sergeant Morrison, who had been waiting nervously near the motor pool for an opportunity to speak with him privately. Mr. Mitchell, Morrison said, his voice shaking slightly. I need to apologize to you. What I said, the way I treated you, there's no excuse for it. Harold looked at the young sergeant, seeing genuine remorse in his eyes. Sergeant, you're a good soldier. You just made a mistake. It wasn't a mistake, Morrison said firmly. It was ignorance and arrogance and cruelty. I had no right to treat you that way, regardless of your background. But, knowing what I know now, Mr. Mitchell, I am so ashamed of myself I can barely function. Harold set down his mail cart and faced Morrison directly. Son, let me tell you something. The measure of a man isn't whether he makes mistakes. Everyone makes mistakes. The measure of a man is what he does after he realizes he's made a mistake. Morrison nodded, tears forming in his eyes. Sir, is there anything I can do to make this right? Harold was quiet for a moment, then said, You can learn from this. You can remember that everyone you meet has a story, and most of those stories involve more struggle and sacrifice than you might imagine. You can treat people with respect not because of what they've accomplished, but because they're human beings who deserve basic dignity. I will, Morrison promised. And, sir, thank you. Thank you for your service. And thank you for being gracious enough to talk to me when you had every right to tell me to go to hell. Harold smiled slightly. Sergeant, I learned a long time ago that carrying anger is like carrying a heavy pack on a long march. It just wears you down and makes the journey harder. As word of Harold's background continued to spread, he began to receive visitors from other veterans who worked on the base. maintenance staff who had served in Iraq and Afghanistan, civilian contractors who were Vietnam veterans, and even some retired military personnel who lived in the area came to pay their respects to a fellow veteran who had served with such distinction. For Harold, the attention was both humbling and overwhelming. He had spent so many years trying to forget the war, trying to live a normal life, that he had almost convinced himself that his service didn't matter anymore. The response from his colleagues and the broader veteran community reminded him that what he had done had real meaning and lasting value. Colonel Hayes made a point of stopping by to see Harold before he left for the day. "Harold, how are you handling all this attention?" Harold smiled. "It's a lot to process, Colonel. I've gotten used to being invisible." "Well, you're not invisible anymore," Hayes said. "And you shouldn't be. What you did deserves to be remembered and honored." As Harold prepared to leave Fort Bradley that evening, he reflected on how much his life had changed in just a few days. For 15 years, he had been just another civilian contractor doing a simple job. Now, he was being recognized as a hero, and soldiers who had once mocked him were seeking him out to thank him for his service. The transformation felt surreal, but it also felt like a form of healing that he hadn't known he needed. For too many years, he had carried the burden of his service alone, believing that his sacrifices didn't matter to anyone but himself and his family. Now, surrounded by the respect and gratitude of his fellow Americans in uniform, Harold Mitchell finally understood that his service had mattered, that his courage had made a difference, and that the legacy of the Filthy 13, both the original unit and his own Vietnam-era version, would live on in the memory of those who understood the true cost of freedom. As he walked to his car, Harold rolled up his sleeve one more time and looked at the faded tattoo that had started all of this. The skull wearing the helmet, the number 13, the words Filthy 13. It all seemed to carry new meaning now. He wasn't just an old postman anymore. He was a keeper of history, a guardian of memory, and a living reminder that heroism comes in many forms, often hidden beneath the most ordinary exteriors.